The smoke rose, thick and black, from the burning wreckage that covered the surface of Verath 7, and Sergeant Elena Vasquez pressed her hand against the wound in her side as she stumbled through the destruction that surrounded her on every side. She was the last one alive from her crew, and she knew this because she had checked every body in the crashed medical frigate before she crawled out into the hellscape that the battle had created. The war between the Galactic Union and the Dominion of Kethra had turned this border world into a graveyard, and Elena had no idea how she was going to survive the night that was coming. Her communication device was dead, her ship was burning, and the nearest friendly outpost was 300 kilometers away, through territory that was crawling with enemies who would kill her on sight. The Kethra were the most feared predators in the known galaxy, and every soldier in the Union had grown up hearing stories about their brutality and their hunger for violence. They stood 8 feet tall, with 4 powerful arms and scales as black as the void between stars, and their teeth were like serrated daggers that could tear through armor like it was nothing more than paper. Elena had seen what they could do to a human body, and the memory made her stomach turn, even now, as she pushed forward through the smoke and the flames. She needed to find shelter before the sun went down, because the Kethra hunted better in the darkness, and she was in no condition to fight anything larger than a rat. Her boots crunched on broken metal and shattered glass as she made her way toward a crashed Kethral warship that lay half buried in the scorched earth ahead of her. The ship was massive and broken and clearly dead, but its hull might provide some protection from the cold night that was coming, and from any predators that might be searching for survivors to finish off. Elena climbed through a tear in the hull and found herself in what had once been a corridor, though now it was filled with debris and bodies and the smell of death that hung heavy in the recycled air. She moved carefully through the darkness, her hands still pressed against her wound, and her eyes scanning every shadow for threats that might be waiting to strike. The Kethral bodies she passed were enormous, even in death, and she felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped over their massive forms and continued deeper into the ship. Then she heard something that made her freeze in place, and her heart began to pound harder in her chest as she tried to identify the sound that had reached her ears. It was a cry, thin and high and desperate, and it was coming from somewhere beneath a collapsed bulkhead just a few meters ahead of her position. Elena told herself to keep walking, because whatever was making that sound was probably dangerous, and she was already injured and alone, and far from any help. But the cry came again, and this time it sounded so much like a human baby that she could not force herself to ignore it and walk away. She moved toward the sound and began to pull away the debris that covered the source of the crying, and her hands were shaking as she worked, because she did not know what she was going to find. When she finally cleared enough wreckage to see what lay beneath, she stopped breathing for a long moment and simply stared at the impossible sight before her eyes. It was a Kethral pup, no larger than a human toddler, with scales that were still soft and gray instead of the hard black armor that adults wore like a second skin. The pup had 4 eyes that blinked up at Elena with terror and confusion, and 4 tiny arms that reached toward her as another cry escaped from its throat. Beside the pup lay the body of an adult Kethra, a female who had clearly died trying to shield her child from the destruction that had torn through the ship. The mother's 4 arms were still wrapped around the space where her pup had been, and Elena could see the wounds that had killed her and the position that told the story of her final moments. She had died protecting her baby, just like any mother from any species would have done in the same situation. Elena stood there for a long time, looking down at the pup and the dead mother, and trying to decide what she should do with what she had found. Every logical part of her brain told her to walk away and leave the pup to die, because it was the child of her enemy, and it would grow up to become a monster that would kill humans without mercy or hesitation. The Kethra had murdered her crew and her friends, and countless other humans in this war that had been raging for longer than Elena had been alive. She owed them nothing, and certainly she did not owe them the life of one small pup that would not survive the night anyway without help. But when she looked into those 4 golden eyes and saw the fear and the loneliness and the desperate need for someone to make the pain stop, she did not see a monster. She saw a baby, alone and afraid and dying, and she could not make herself walk away, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was the right thing to do. Elena reached down and lifted the pup from the debris, and the small creature immediately pressed against her chest and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a whimper. The pup was cold and hungry and probably injured, and Elena knew that keeping her alive was going to make her own survival much harder than it already was. She pulled the thermal blanket from her pack and wrapped it around the tiny body that trembled against her own, and she held the pup close as she whispered words that she knew the creature could not understand. "I have got you," she said softly, and she felt the pup relax slightly in her arms as the warmth of the blanket began to seep into her small body. "I have got you, and I am not going to let anything hurt you." Elena looked down at the dead mother one more time and made a silent promise to the fallen warrior who had given everything to protect her child. "I will keep her safe," Elena whispered. "I swear to you that I will keep her safe no matter what it costs me." She turned and began to make her way out of the wrecked ship, carrying the pup against her chest and trying not to think about how impossible her situation had just become. The galaxy was going to hunt them both now, because neither side would accept what she had done or what she was planning to do. The Union would want the pup destroyed as a dangerous alien specimen, and the Kethra would want Elena executed for daring to touch one of their young. But none of that mattered to Elena as she stepped out into the fading light of the dying day and began to walk toward an uncertain future. Uncertain future. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences no matter where they led her. "I need to call you something," she said to the pup, who looked up at her with those 4 golden eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any infant should possess. Elena thought about the mother who had died protecting this small life, and she thought about the fire that had consumed the ship and the hope that still burned in her own chest despite everything. "Kira," she said finally, and the name felt right on her tongue as she spoke it into the smoky air. "Your name is Kira, and you are mine now." The pup made that purring sound again and pressed closer against Elena's chest, and together they walked into the darkness that was falling over the broken world. They were alone and hunted and far from any safety, but they had each other, and for now, that would have to be enough. 6 months had passed since Elena had pulled Kira from the wreckage of that Kethral warship, and in that time they had become ghosts who drifted through the darkest corners of known space. Elena had learned very quickly that she could not trust anyone with the truth about what she was carrying, because the moment anyone saw Kira, they would either try to kill her or try to take her away. The Galactic Union had put out a warrant for Elena within the first week, and the official document called Kira a dangerous xenospecimen that needed to be terminated for the safety of all Union citizens. The Kethral Dominion had declared Elena to be a kidnapper and a child thief, and they had promised that anyone who brought her to them would be rewarded beyond their wildest dreams. The punishment they promised for Elena was something called ritual execution, which apparently involved 17 different star systems and more pain than any human could possibly endure. Imagine, Elena did not plan to find out what that meant. And so she kept moving from station to station and planet to planet, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. She had been Special Forces before she transferred to the Medical Corps, and those skills were the only reason she and Kira had survived this long in a galaxy that wanted them both dead. Elena knew how to disappear, And she knew how to fight, and she knew how to make people regret ever trying to take something that belonged to her. Kira grew faster than Elena had expected, and within those first 6 months, the tiny pup had transformed into something that stood almost at Elena's shoulder. Her scales had begun to harden from their soft gray into the dark black armor that adult Kethra wore, and her 4 arms had grown strong enough to bend metal when she got frustrated or scared. Elena had been terrified at first that Kira would forget who had saved her, would turn on her as the predator instincts kicked in, but the opposite had happened instead. Kira had imprinted on Elena in a way that the human did not fully understand, and the bond between them had grown stronger with every passing day. The Kethral young chose their parents through this imprinting process, and once that choice was made, it could never be undone or transferred to anyone else. Kira had chosen Elena in those first moments when the human had lifted her from the wreckage and promised to keep her safe. And now, nothing in the galaxy could break that connection. Elena taught Kira everything she knew about survival and about the galaxy and about the war that had made them both into outcasts and refugees. Kira learned quickly, and her intelligence surprised Elena more with each passing week, as the young predator absorbed information like a sponge soaking up water. The first time Kira spoke in common was a moment that Elena would never forget, even though the words were broken and rough and hard to understand. They had been hiding in an abandoned mining station when a group of bounty hunters had found their trail and cornered them in a dead-end corridor with no way out. Elena had pushed Kira behind her and drawn her weapon, ready to fight and die to protect the child who had become her entire world. But Kira had stepped forward instead, her 4 arms spread wide, and her golden eyes blazing with a fury that made even Elena take a step back in surprise. "Elena," Kira had growled, her voice deep and rough, but clear enough to understand. "Safe. Mine." Then she had launched herself at the bounty hunters with a speed and power that Elena had never seen before, and within seconds all 5 of them were on the ground and not moving. Kira had turned back to Elena with blood on her claws and that same protective fury still burning in her eyes, and she had repeated those words again as if to make sure. Elena understood. That was the moment she truly grasped what she had created by saving this small life from the wreckage of war. She had not just rescued a Kethral pup from death. She had gained a protector who would destroy anything that threatened the human she had chosen as her mother. Word began to spread through the underworld networks that connected the lawless parts of the galaxy, and the stories that people told about Elena and Kira grew more incredible with each retelling. They said that the human woman fought like a Kethra, with a ferocity and skill that no normal person should possess. They said that the Kethra guarded like a human, with a loyalty and love that the predator species was never supposed to be capable of feeling. People gave them names that stuck and spread and became legend in the dark places where criminals and refugees gathered to hide from the law. They called Elena the Mother of Fangs, because she had taken one of the galaxy's deadliest predators and turned her into a daughter. They called Kira the Human Shadow because she was never more than a step behind Elena, and because anyone who threatened her mother disappeared into darkness and was never seen again. The bounty hunters kept coming because the rewards were too large for desperate people to ignore, and each time they came, they learned why so many others had failed before them. Elena and Kira fought side by side with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, as if they could read each other's minds and predict each other's movements. The human would create openings, and the predator would strike with deadly precision, and together they cut through anyone foolish enough to challenge them. Kethral retrieval squads came as well, sent by the Dominion to reclaim the stolen child and punish the human who had dared to take her. But Kira refused to go with them. made her refusal very clear by sending the survivors back to their masters with a message written in the blood of their fallen comrades. The message was simple: I chose my mother, and you will not take her from me. Union containment teams came with tranquilizers and capture nets, and orders to bring in the specimen alive if possible. And each team returned with fewer members than they had started with. Elena never killed when she did not have to, but she made sure that everyone who came for them understood the cost of trying again. 3 years passed this way, with Elena and Kira moving through the shadows and building a reputation that grew larger than either of them had ever intended. They were no longer just a human and a Kethra hiding from the galaxy. They had become something else entirely. They had become a legend that people whispered about in bars and trading posts and military briefings across 1,000 different worlds. The proof that everything both sides believed about each other might be wrong. And they had become a family, forged in fire and blood, and the desperate need to protect the only thing that mattered in a galaxy full of enemies. Elena looked at Kira one night as they sat together in yet another temporary hiding place, and she saw not a monster or a weapon, but simply her daughter. "I love you," Elena said softly, and Kira's golden eyes brightened as she pressed her massive head against her mother's shoulder. "Love, Elena," Kira rumbled back, her voice still rough, but filled with an emotion that transcended language and species. "Always, forever, mine." Together they faced the darkness, and together they survived. 10 years had passed since Elena had found Kira in the wreckage of that Kethral warship, and in that time everything had changed, except for the bond that held them together. Kira now stood at her full adult height of 8 feet, with 4 powerful arms that could tear through hull plating like it was wet cardboard, and scales so black they seemed to absorb light itself. Her teeth were like the serrated daggers that all Kethra possessed, and her golden eyes held an intelligence and awareness that made even hardened criminals nervous when she looked at them. But despite all of this terrifying power, she still moved through crowds with her head slightly lowered, and her body positioned one step behind Elena, always watching and always ready to protect. Elena had aged in those 10 years, with gray touching her temples and new scars mapping the landscape of her skin, like a record of every battle they had survived together. Her body ached in ways it never had. When she was younger, and some mornings she moved slowly until her joints loosened up and remembered how to work properly. But her eyes remained as sharp as they had ever been, and her reputation had grown into something so large that it sometimes felt like a separate entity walking beside her. They had come to Axios Prime because they needed supplies and information, and the neutral station was one of the few places in the galaxy where enemies could exist in the same space without killing each other. The station was a lawless haven, where criminals and refugees and exiles gathered to trade and drink and share stories about the things they had seen and done. Elena walked through the crowded corridors with Kira at her shoulder, and she watched as people noticed them and stepped aside to let them pass without complaint. Some of them recognized her face from the wanted posters that still circulated through Union space, and some of them recognized Kira from the dominant retrieval notices that promised wealth to anyone who could bring her home. But none of them made any move to collect those rewards, because everyone on this station knew the stories, and everyone understood what would happen if they tried. A pirate captain named Vorok was drinking at a bar when Elena walked past, and she watched as his hand moved toward the weapon at his hip before stopping halfway there. He looked at Elena, then at Kira, then back at Elena again, and his face went pale beneath the tattoos that covered his green skin. "Not worth it," he muttered to his crew as he pulled his hand away from his gun and picked up his drink instead. Not against her, not for any price. His first mate looked confused and started to argue, but Vorok cut him off with a sharp gesture and a glare that promised violence if the younger man did not shut up immediately. "Do you know who that is?" Vorok asked, in a low voice that Elena could still hear, because Kira's ears were much better than human ears, and she always shared what she heard with her mother. "That is the mother of Fangs, and the shadow behind her has killed more hunters than any predator in recorded history." The first mate went pale as well, and suddenly became very interested in his drink. Stories like this followed Elena everywhere she went, and each one added another layer to the legend that had grown around her and Kira over the years. A Union admiral named Chen had personally rescinded a kill order against Elena 3 years ago, and when his superiors demanded an explanation, he had told them the truth without any shame. That woman has survived 37 confirmed engagements against trained military units, bounty hunter teams, and Kethrall retrieval squads, Admiral Chen had said in his official report. "I am not adding my fleet to her record, and if you want to try, then you can lead the mission yourself." Quietly shelved after that, and no one had mentioned it again. Even the Kethra had stopped sending retrieval squads after the incident on Station Karveth, when a war priest named Thorin had encountered Elena and Kira in a marketplace, and had done something that no one expected. He had looked at Kira for a long moment, studying the way she stood behind her human mother, and the way her eyes constantly scanned for threats to Elena's safety. Then he had bowed, low and deep, in the way that Kethra only bowed to those who had earned their respect through combat or honor. "The human has earned the right," Thorin had told his commanders when he returned to Dominion space, without attempting to take Kira by force. "By our own laws, the pup chose her mother through the sacred bond of imprinting, and we have no claim on a child who has already been claimed." This had caused a massive argument in the Dominion Council, but in the end, the war priest's words had carried weight, because he was one of the most respected warriors in Kethrall space. The retrieval orders had not been officially cancelled, but no more squads had been sent, and Elena had noticed the difference immediately. Now she walked through Axios Prime, with the weight of all those stories pressing down on her shoulders, and she felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She had never wanted to become a legend, and she had never sought out the reputation that now preceded her wherever she went in the galaxy. All she had ever wanted was to keep her daughter safe, and everything else had been a consequence of that simple desire. They found a quiet corner of the station where they could eat and rest without too many eyes watching them, and Elena leaned back against the wall as Kira settled beside her. "You are tired," Kira said in that deep rumbling voice that had become as familiar to Elena as her own heartbeat. "Rest more, mother." Elena smiled at the word that Kira had started using a few years ago, after she had learned enough about human families to understand what it meant. "I am fine," Elena said, though they both knew it was not entirely true. "Just thinking about how strange our lives have become." Kira made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a purr, and she pressed her massive head against Elena's shoulder the way she had done since she was small enough to fit in the human's arms. "Strange is good," Kira said softly. "Strange means we are alive, and we are together, and no one can take that away from us." Elena reached up and rested her hand on Kira's head, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body through the hard scales that protected her. "No," Elena agreed quietly, "no one can take that away from us." But even as she said the words, she knew that the galaxy was not done with them yet. There were rumors spreading through the Waterhole Station about a new crisis brewing between the Union and the Dominion. Something big enough that it might restart the war that had been simmering for so long. And Elena had a feeling that she and Kira were going to be pulled into the middle of it, whether they wanted to be or not. For now, though, she simply sat with her daughter in the quiet corner of a lawless station, and she let herself enjoy the peace while it lasted. The legend could wait, and the galaxy could wait, because right now the only thing that mattered was the warmth of Kira beside her and the knowledge that they had survived another day together. That was enough, and it would always be enough, no matter what came next. The message had found them on a small trading post at the edge of known space, and Elena had read it 3 times before she believed what it was asking them to do. Both the Galactic Union and the Dominion of Kethra wanted Elena and Kira to come to a peace summit, and both sides had promised safe passage and diplomatic protection if they agreed. The crisis that Elena had sensed coming had finally arrived, and it was worse than anything she could have imagined. A radical faction within the Dominion had assassinated a Union ambassador on neutral ground, and the killing had been brutal and public and designed to cause maximum outrage. The Union was mobilizing retaliation fleets that would strike at Kethral colony worlds within days, and the Dominion was preparing its own war fleet to meet them head-on. Billions of lives hung in the balance, and both sides knew that if the shooting started this time, it would not stop until one civilization or the other was completely destroyed. Desperate times had led to desperate measures, and someone on both sides had remembered the legend of the Mother of Fangs and her shadow. Elena and Kira were the only intermediaries that neither side would dare to attack, because their reputation made them untouchable, and their story made them symbols of what peace might look like. "We do not have to go," Kira said, as Elena finished reading the message for the 4th time. "We owe them nothing, and they have done nothing but hunt us for 10 years. Elena looked at her daughter and saw the anger burning in those golden eyes, and she understood it, because she felt the same fire in her own chest. The Union had called Kira a specimen and tried to have her killed, and the Dominion had called Elena a thief and promised to execute her in 17 star systems. Neither side deserved their help, and neither side had any right to ask for it. But Elena also thought about the billions of innocent people who would die if the war started, humans in Kethra who had never done anything wrong except be born on the wrong side of a border. She thought about mothers who would lose their children, and children who would lose their parents, and families that would be torn apart by violence they had never asked for. "We have to go," Elena said finally, and she saw Kira's eyes narrow with frustration. "Not for them, but for everyone who will die if we do not at least try." Kira was silent for a long moment, and Elena could see the conflict playing out behind her daughter's eyes as she struggled with her own anger and her own sense of justice. Then Kira let out a long breath and nodded slowly, because she had learned from Elena that sometimes doing the right thing meant putting aside your own feelings for the sake of others. "I will not let them hurt you," Kira said in a voice that left no room for argument. "If anyone tries anything, I will end them before they can blink." Elena smiled and reached up to touch her daughter's face, feeling the hard scales beneath her fingers and the warmth of the life that pulsed beneath them. "I know you will," Elena said softly. "That is why I am not afraid." The Concord of Ashes was a massive space station that had been built specifically for peace negotiations, and it floated in the empty void between Union and Dominion space. Elena and Kira arrived in a small ship that had been provided by neutral parties, and they were escorted to the main summit hall by guards from both sides who watched them with a mixture of fear and awe. The hall itself was enormous, with high ceilings and walls made of some kind of translucent material that let starlight filter through in shimmering patterns. Delegates from both civilizations filled the room, Union politicians in their formal uniforms, and Kethral warriors in their ceremonial armor, all of them watching the door as Elena and Kira entered. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, and Elena could feel the weight of every eye pressing down on her as she walked toward the center of the hall, with Kira at her shoulder. She was a small human woman in battered armor that had seen too many battles, and behind her walked an 8-foot-tall predator who moved like death itself, given physical form. Together they made their way to the speaking platform at the center of the room, and Elena felt her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared to do something she had never imagined doing. She was going to speak for peace, and she was going to use her own story as proof that the hatred between these two civilizations was not inevitable. "I have spent 10 years being hunted by both of you," Elena said, and her voice carried through the silent hall without any need for amplification. "My daughter has been called an abomination by her own species, and a monster by mine," and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of delegates from both sides, who stared back at her with expressions that ranged from hostility to curiosity to something that might have been hope. "And yet here we are, standing before you as proof that your hatred is a choice and not a law." Kira stepped forward then, and Elena watched as the Kethral delegates tensed at the sight of one of their own moving toward them with purpose in her stride. But Kira did not attack, and instead she began to speak in the Kethral language with a fluency and power that made several of the elders lean forward in surprise. "I was not stolen," Kira said, her voice deep and resonant with the harmonic undertones that the Kethral language required. "I was saved by a human who had every reason to let me die, and who chose mercy instead of revenge." She turned to look at Elena with those golden eyes that held more love than any predator was supposed to be capable of. "My birth mother died protecting me, and my second mother has done the same every day since she found me in the wreckage of war." Kira looked back at the Dominion elders with a fierce pride that made even the most hardened warriors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "You call humans weak because they are small and soft and breakable, but you are wrong." Her voice rose with an intensity that filled the entire hall. "They are small, and they are soft, and they are breakable, and they fight anyway against enemies that should destroy them without effort." Kira bared her teeth in what might have been a smile, or might have been a threat. "That is not weakness, that is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen." The Dominion warlord rose from his seat, an ancient Kethra covered in scars that told the story of 1,000 battles survived. He was the most feared predator in known space, the commander of fleets that had destroyed entire worlds. And he was looking at Kira with an expression that Elena could not read. Then he looked at Elena, and she saw something change in his eyes as he studied the small human woman who had raised one of his kind as her own daughter. The warlord reached down and lifted the ceremonial blade from his belt, and Elena felt Kira tense beside her, ready to attack if needed. But instead of raising the weapon, the warlord placed it flat on the table before him and sat back down in his chair. "Speak your terms, Mother of Fangs," he said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. "The Dominion will listen." The Union representatives looked at each other in shock, because no one had expected the warlord to yield so easily to anyone, let alone a human. But Elena understood what had just happened, and she felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that everything she and Kira had survived had led to this moment. The legend had done its work. Now it was time to build something better from the ashes of the old hatred. Elena took a deep breath and began to speak, outlining terms for peace that she had been thinking about for years during all those long nights of running and hiding. And for the first time in a decade, both sides actually listened. 20 years had passed since the Treaty of Vasquez had ended the threat of war between the Galactic Union and the Dominion of Kethra, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The peace was not perfect, and tensions still flared sometimes when old hatreds bubbled up to the surface, or when new generations forgot why their parents had agreed to stop fighting. But open war had become unthinkable for both sides, because the cost was too high, and the memory of what had almost happened was still too fresh in everyone's minds. Elena Vasquez had lived to see her work take root and grow, and she had watched with quiet pride as the galaxy slowly learned to be better than it had been before. She had settled on a small colony world at the edge of Union space, in a modest home surrounded by gardens that she tended with her own hands when her body allowed it. The fame she had never wanted had faded over the years into something quieter, respect that people showed her, not because they feared her, but because they were grateful for what she had done. She was 73 years old now, and her body had finally begun to fail her in ways that no amount of willpower could overcome. The doctors had told her that she did not have much time left, and she had accepted the news with the same calm courage that had defined her entire life. Kira had been at her side through all of it, just as she had been at her side for the past 30 years since Elena had pulled her from the wreckage of war. The massive Kethra rarely left the small house anymore, preferring to stay close to her mother rather than travel to the places where her diplomatic work sometimes called her. She knew that the end was coming, and she wanted to be there when it did. Elena passed away on a quiet evening as the sun was setting over the gardens she loved so much, with Kira holding her hand in all four of hers. Words she spoke were barely a whisper, but Kira heard them clearly because her ears had always been sharp enough to catch even the softest sounds. "I love you, my daughter," Elena said, and then she closed her eyes for the last time and was still. Kira did not move for a long time after that, and she did not make any sound as the tears ran down her scaled face and dripped onto the blanket that covered her mother's body. She had known this day was coming, but no amount of preparation could have made it hurt any less. The funeral was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before, because Elena Vasquez had touched so many lives in so many different ways. Union admirals stood beside Kethral war priests in the memorial garden that had been built on the colony world, and former enemies shared silence as they paid tribute to the woman who had shown them a better way. Politicians who had once ordered her death now spoke of her courage and her vision. Warriors who had once hunted her now bowed their heads in respect for all she had accomplished. Kira stood at the front of the gathering in her formal diplomatic robes, but she did not speak during the service. She simply watched as person after person came forward to share their memories of Elena, and she listened as the legend grew even larger, now that the woman behind it was gone. After the ceremony ended and the crowds had departed, Kira remained at the grave alone. She stood there motionless for 3 days, not eating or sleeping or moving, just staring at the stone that marked the place where her mother now rested. The colonists who lived nearby grew worried, and tried to approach her several times, but something in her eyes warned them to keep their distance. On the 4th day, Kira finally stirred and took a deep breath that seemed to fill her entire massive body. She reached up and touched the metal chain around her neck, where Elena's old, military dog tags hung against her scales. Then she turned and walked away from the grave, carrying nothing else with her except the memories of the woman who had saved her life and taught her how to love. Kira became an ambassador after that, though not in any official capacity that either government recognized or controlled. She traveled to war zones and first contact situations, to anywhere fear threatened to become violence, and hatred threatened to tear apart the fragile peace that Elena had built. She never drew a weapon during these missions, and she never needed to, because everyone knew who she was, and everyone knew her story, and that was enough to make even the most aggressive warriors pause and reconsider their actions. "The human shadow still walks," people would whisper when they heard she was coming. "The daughter of the Mother of Fangs is on her way." And then the weapons would be lowered, and the shouting would stop. Actually sit down and talk instead of fighting. The legend spread to species who had never met humans, to distant arms of the galaxy where Earth was just a rumor, and the Union was only a name they had heard in passing. Traders carried the story to new worlds, and diplomats shared it in negotiations with civilizations that had never known war between predator and prey species could end in anything other than extinction. The story always began the same way. A human woman found a predator's child in the wreckage of war, and she chose mercy instead of revenge. The story always continued through the years of running and hiding, through the battles that built a reputation, through the summit that changed everything. And the story always ended with the same words that people spoke in hushed voices wherever the tale was told. Even now, when Kira of Two Mothers walks into a room, enemies lower their weapons before her. Claws, though her claws could tear through starship hulls without effort. Not because they fear her teeth, though her teeth could bite through armor like it was nothing. They lower their weapons because they remember the human who taught the galaxy's greatest predator how to love, and they are afraid of disappointing her memory. Kira lived for another 200 years after Elena passed, because the Kethra lived much longer than humans, and because she had inherited her mother's stubborn refusal to give up. She visited Elena's grave every year on the anniversary of her death, and she always brought flowers from the garden that she still tended herself. And sometimes, when the night was quiet and the stars were bright, she would sit beside the grave and talk to her mother as if Elena could still hear her. She would tell Elena about the lives she had saved, and the wars she had prevented, and the children who had grown up in peace, because of what though? Two of them had started together. And she would always end with the same words, spoken softly into the darkness. I kept your promise, Mother. I kept the galaxy safe, just like you taught me. And I will keep doing it until my last breath, because that is what you would have wanted. The legend of the Mother of Fangs and her shadow continued to grow long after both of them were gone, passed down from generation to generation as proof that love was stronger than hatred. And somewhere in the stars, in a place beyond death and beyond memory, Elena Vasquez smiled, because she had done exactly what she had set out to do all those years ago when she pulled a tiny predator pup from the wreckage and promised to keep her safe. She had changed the galaxy, one act of mercy at a time.